Mhm. Okay, but again, regarding issues related to agency and agents and things like that, what should we call an agent? Because I think that when people talk about something or someone being an agent, most of the time at least they're thinking about a being at least that is able to control its actions at least to a certain degree and perhaps create some modifications in the world around it, because I mean even we have these cognitive tool that we've evolved that is called the hyperactive agency detection device, and when we see something happen in the world, we immediately tend to think that something or someone caused it. We attribute agency to causation, let's say. So, I mean, if we really arrive to a point where we know that what happens, even in us as humans consciously, is not really that important in terms of regulating behavior and controlling it and things like that, and doesn't have an important causal relationship with behavior. I mean, what should we call an agent then?
Yeah, so I like to think, I try to think of, what we might call the minimal requirements for agency, right? So the first minimal requirement for agency would be something like causal responsibility. It's not the same as moral responsibility. It's not the same as legal responsibility. It's not the same as social responsibility, etc. Right? These are all various degrees of responsibility that are in some ways parasitic on causal responsibility. Causal responsibility, to put it simply, is the idea that the thing itself is the cause of what happened, right? So, for example, if you decide to leave the tavern on your own volition, right, your own 2 feet, you're the cause of your leaving of the tavern, right? But if you happen to get a little raucous in the tavern and the bouncer picks you up and tosses you through the tavern doors, yeah, it's true that there was a leaving of the tavern by you, right? But you did not cause that to happen, right? It was not something that proceeded from your internal states. Now, obviously, we need some additional qualifications here. So in order to separate this out from mechanical causation, right? So, for example, a tree, you might say, rots on its own. It's causally responsible for its rotting, in a sense, maybe. But would we call that an agent? Well, obviously not. To have a better example, right? You've got door openers that are automatic that use infrared and lasers to determine whether or not an object is moving, whether it's of a sufficient size to trigger the opening of the door. Are these automatic door openers agents? Using a system that simple. When an alarm triggers because there's an intruder, is the alarm an agent because it's causally responsible for the signaling that there's an intruder? No, there has to be some additional qualifications. So another qualification that I like to attach to this is that the behavior has to be flexible, adaptively flexible. Right. So in order to eliminate these mechanical behaviors, what we want to see in a creature is that when it runs up against a problem, it's able to try to solve and figure out a way around that problem to achieve the goal that it seems to have, that its behavior indicates it has. So, if there's a, if you were to present a piece of food to something, and it seems to come after the food. It wants the food. The animal wants the food, and then you put a bowl over the food. Well, what's it going to do? Is it going to forget that the food's there altogether, or is it going to draw upon its resources, perhaps memory, its motor resources, motor activity, things like that, and try to figure out, I know there's food here a second ago, so, what's going on, right? An automatic door opener is not going to run through this same series to figure out, like, well, I thought there was a person here a second ago, so, should I open the door or should I not open the door? It's what we might call a fixed response to an environmental stimulus, right? Whereas in the case of an agent, what we're going to find are malleable responses to environmental stimuli. And I think that the quality of the behavior, the complexity of the behavior, scales up with the complexity of the organism. All right. So I couldn't tell you exactly where agency begins. I don't want to say that, the cutoff is the bumblebee, but we leave the mosquito behind. I don't want to say that the cutoff is as high up the chain as that of a canine, and we leave everything else behind. It's something that I think we need to explore through comparative studies, through ethological studies, just to see exactly how complex is the behavior that these different creatures exhibit. And it's kind of refreshing to see research finally going into insect behavior, because I think we're starting to learn that even their behavior is more complex than we've imagined up to this point.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now let's talk about self-deception, because I mean, this nowadays is a very complicated topic, because I think that from a biological / psychological perspective, the first big name, the first person that really tackled this issue from an evolutionary perspective was perhaps Robert Rivers, and he said basically that it would make sense from an evolutionary perspective for us to have evolved self-deception as an adaptation of the mind, because it would make it much more easy for us to deceive other people as well, if we beforehand deceive ourselves, because if we know that we are telling a lie, perhaps something in our behavior would give the other person certain signs or cues, and she would be able to read through our lies, and so it would really mess our strategy, let's say our social strategy there. But
Sure.
Recently I've talked with Robert Kurzban, and I bring this to the table because your dissertation is based on the modularist approach to the human mind, coming from an evolutionary psychology, and he really recently questioned the approach made by Robert Rivers, in the sense that he says that perhaps it is not really that we hold two beliefs at the same time, and perhaps one of them is not available to us consciously, but it's just that in different situations, different modules that lead to different beliefs are more or less active, and perhaps that also happens in different social situations and with different people, and so on and so forth. So what would you have to say about that?
Yeah, so I admire Robert Trivers and William von Hippel's theory. I think it was a great step forward, applying evolutionary theory to classical philosophical psychological problems. It raises a number of issues, though, right? And one of the issues is that, well, if you are deceiving yourself in such a way that you're no longer aware of the deception, to what degree is it even worth calling it deception, right? You sincerely believe that X or Y is true, so how can it be classified as self-deception? Why isn't it just you're mistaken or you're wrong or anything else? I mean, it's not clear when we go headway into that. that we can any longer distinguish the difference between a mistaken belief and a belief that you've somehow adopted as your own to deceive yourself. The other question, of course, this raises is, what is it that you're deceiving, right? If you are adopting a belief strategically as your own in an effort to deceive yourself, well, what is what is it that you're trying to deceive in the first place? It's almost as if there's a covert Cartesian assumption of the self being packaged into the theory. Now, I like the idea. I'm very, very fond of modularity theory, and I think it's extremely helpful in a number of ways. But when it comes down to it, I still want to understand the phenomenon of self-deception as something that's irrational, as something that is maladaptive. And so I have to ask myself, well, how can we do this? How can we do this in an evolutionary framework? And I think that when it comes down to it, self-deception has nothing to do with deception. And I think that's kind of been the problem for a long time, because as soon as we invoke, it's almost as if we've used a very poor word to describe the phenomenon, because we think of self-deception as involving this intent to deceive, and that only introduces a paradox, namely, what's being deceived, what's doing the deceiving, right? How is it possible that you can at once know something is true and yet deny that it's true at the same time? This seems like a contradiction. And the modularity approach has a very elegant solution to that, which is just that modules are they are encapsulated, insulated from one another, and so what one module acknowledges, another module doesn't have to acknowledge, right? And that's a solution that works. It's not too dissimilar from the solution that Davidson adopts. He also compartmentalizes the mind and says that we can explain self-deception by thinking of the mind in terms of parts, that one part acknowledges this, the other part denies it, so now you've got your self-deception. But again, I think all of this goes too far and it gets unnecessarily complicated. I see self-deception as almost an evolved response that at times can be adaptive and at times can be maladaptive. And what is that evolved response? It's a firing of a fight or flight response in response to mental contents, if you will. So you imagine that things can be thus and so, but rather than confirm or disconfirm that things are thus and so, the possibility that it's thus and so is so frightening, so terrifying, that you turn away from it altogether. So you're sleeping in you're sleeping in your room at night. There's a flash of lightning. The room illuminates briefly, and you see this figure in the corner of your room, right? Overcome with terror, you're like, oh my gosh, maybe somebody's in the room. I feel like I just saw somebody in the room. Well, what do you do? Well, the rational thing to do would be to turn on the lights, look to see if anybody's there, or, if you're really aggressive, just go straight towards the thing and try to tackle it, right? But so many of us, instead, we take the cover, pull it up over our heads, and we're just like, let's hope for the best, right? So we avoid the truth, namely of whether or not there's actually something there or not there, hoping that things will work out anyway. And to me, I think that really strikes at the heart of self-deception. It's an avoidance strategy that we use as a kind of flight response from things that we think are probable, or to some degree, right? It doesn't have to be almost a near certainty. And in fact, there's a lot of research that shows that the more likely something is, the more likely we are to finally concede and say, yeah, I guess I need to do something about this. We do this with our health all the time, right? We see some minor symptoms suggesting that there could be a problem. And we're like, oh, nothing's wrong, I'm fine, I'm not going to go to the doctor, I'm just going to wait it out, everything's going to go back to normal. But eventually, if there is an actual problem, you sort of reach this critical mass where it's unavoidable at that point. You're like, I really need to see a doctor. This is not going away. My quality of life is impacted. Everybody around me sees that there's an issue, so I need to go and get this figured out, checked out, etc. And I find self-deception works a lot in this way, and that in itself is a form of self-deception. That, you know, when there's a possibility for something to be either true or false, rather than, and it's something that frightens us, rather than try to confirm or disconfirm it, we avoid it and hope that it works out.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so would another good example of self-deception that is maladaptive, would it be perhaps overconfidence? That is when people are so full of themselves that they might put themselves through certain risks that at the extreme might even kill them.
So it kind of depends on the cause of the overconfidence. I think that's where we can really start figuring out whether or not that counts as a form of self-deception. Is the overconfidence a response to a fear that, you know, maybe you're not what you think you are? Or is it just another symptom of what we call the superiority bias, where you think that you're much better than everybody else around you? In the latter case, I'm more inclined to classify that as a form of wishful thinking rather than a form of self-deception. And I do think that the two phenomena are distinct from one another. So how does wishful thinking work as opposed to self-deception? Wishful thinking seems to involve, you know, a belief that you want to be true so badly, you take it to be true, right? But now the question is, well, you know, what kind of belief is it? Why would you do this, etc.? And I think the answer to that is that many of the beliefs that are caused by our wishes that we want to be true involve ourselves, right? We wish so badly that we're very good at you know, basketball, for example, or we wish so badly that we're an intellectual, or we wish so badly that we're attractive. So there's an element to these fantasies that is self-enhancing. And the only reason this makes any sense whatsoever is when you consider the fact that we are social creatures, that, you know, we're self-enhancing because we're hoping that others will recognize that things are that way as well and affirm that, you know, we really are good at basketball or attractive or intelligent. So wishful thinking results as a kind of, it's strategic. I think it's a reputation enhancing strategy that, you know, you sort of optimistically buy into this fantasy, and that in turn inclines you to action, to put these things into action, to test against that. Sometimes it works out. Sometimes it doesn't, though. And much of that depends on the standards of the community to which you're appealing, right? So if you're a scientist, then the standards of the community to which you're appealing is experimental success, right? So you want to say, look, gosh, you know, I've got this idea, I've got this theory, it's testable, and I think it's right. And you devote all of your time and energy, perhaps even your career, to try to prove whether or not that's true or false. Now, if that works out, you're a genius, right? If that doesn't work out, you've wasted your entire life's work pursuing something, you know, that you could have been using your mental resources towards something else. You might call it, in a sense, irrational or crazy, right? But you know, it's not necessarily, it's not that that's a bad thing to choose, because there might be fruit that comes out of the failures that ends up being worthwhile, especially if you're engaged with the scientific community, right? Because your peers are there to guide your thoughts, to give you important feedback, and to help make sure that things progress, even in the light of failure, that there's still something worthwhile that comes out of that. If you're a conspiracy theorist, now there's no way to there's nothing that can come out of that, right? I want to be careful there, because, you know, just because something's a conspiracy theory doesn't mean that's necessarily false. It's unlikely to be true, but you know, I'm impatient. I'm an impatient intellectual, and for me, it's a waste of time. But you know, there's not really a good reason to buy into these things. But the reason that we might do that is because we want to appeal to a particular community, right? So there's this community that thinks that there's this government, the shadow government, that's running everything, and by buying into that and then looking for evidence and distorting the things that we find and promoting that, we in turn raise our reputation, our standing within that community, and you know, it's something that it works out for that individual, but you know, it might be maladaptive, because even though there's success within that niche community, it comes at the cost of success in the broader community at large, of which they're a part of, right? So, you know, you're unlikely to have a successful academic career. You're unlikely to be taken seriously by intellectuals when you endeavor upon that way of life. Whether or not that's important to you, it's a different question.
Yeah, but perhaps, I mean, conspiracy theories, perhaps believing in them and promoting them could be a good strategy to certain types of people. Perhaps, I mean, perhaps it is even useful or good from an evolutionary perspective to certain people to adopt that kind of intellectual position, because, for example, if they were to try to elevate their reputation in the mainstream population, let's say, it would be very difficult for them, because they would be competing with much more people, and if they create their niche group with a few people where they are able to really elevate themselves to a good enough position, perhaps from an evolutionary perspective, to have access to more resources, including sexual resources as well. Perhaps the fact that they are defending and promoting and believing in something that is completely disconnected from reality, let's say, I mean, it could have some social value to them, perhaps.
Absolutely, and you know, I want to make clear, it's not necessarily maladaptive, right? I mean, these things are a lot of fun. I derive great pleasure from seeing the wild conspiracy theories that people come up with, and I'm sure that, you know, for them, there's a satisfying element to that. People admire them, you know, even if you don't believe in it. Some people will just admire the creativity, such as myself. I'm just like, you know, I fundamentally disagree with you, but that's, you know, good on you for putting that much effort into that. You know, it only becomes maladaptive, wishful thinking, when it starts to compromise your ability to flourish within one of those evolutionary domains, and arguably across all of the evolutionary domains, right? So when it jeopardizes your well-being, right, because you're paranoid that you know, government agents are after you, so you wire up your home with all sorts of booby traps, and you know, there's a risk that that could end up harming you in the long run, or somebody calls you know, some sort of government agency on you, and you know, that never ends well. That's not good. That's maladaptive, right? It jeopardizes your survival. It could jeopardize your, you know, sexual options, right? If you say something that's so outlandish that it only totally isolates you from everyone else, less likely in today's connected world where you seem to be able to find a niche for just about anything on the internet. But certainly in the past, where when you're part of a much smaller community, you would not be advertising these things if it runs counter to what the community tends to believe. And then obviously socially, right? That overlaps a little bit with the sexual opportunities, the mating opportunities, but you know, it has more to do with one's reputation within the community, and you know, you can start to feel as though you're ostracized, and I think we've evolved to be terrified of feeling ostracized, feeling like we're not contributing anything, right? That in itself motivates us to want to be a part of a community, to contribute to that community, to be productive.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about the modular or the modularist approach to the human mind, that is the mind being divided into several different cognitive modules, each of which evolved to deal with a very specific kind of evolutionarily relevant problem, let's put it that way. But I would like to ask you, what is your position about that? Because even among evolutionary psychologists and people that accept this approach, they don't all think about it in the same ways. So, for example, there are people that really have an approach of the massive modularity of the human mind, where they really believe that it is all modules, domain-specific modules, and nothing else. And then there are people that refer to, for example, learning processes and say or defend the idea that perhaps we have some I don't know if we should call them modules or not, but perhaps cognitive systems of the mind that are domain general and open-ended, because it really seems from a certain perspective that people are able to learn virtually anything, even things like quantum physics and mathematics, which from an evolutionary perspective, I mean, they are so counterintuitive that it doesn't really seem to make sense for us to even be able to learn about those things. So what do you think about that?
So the modularity thesis is the newest part of my project, and as such, it's the least developed. It's one of the the legs of the tripod that I've constructed for myself that I plan to hopefully spend my career studying. So I don't have as much input on this as I would like. I can just kind of tell you where I tentatively stand on things, and that's that I take an extremely fine-grained approach to the mind, and I think that there are composite modules that are composed of submodules, if you will. But I think this goes down to some really simple workings that, I don't even think we've come close to scratching the surface of exactly how the mind works. So again, to invoke that analogy of what we understand about the visual system, I think what we're going to find when we start taking the modularity approach seriously and looking at it, how it constructs cognition, is that, you've got a submodule for, causal reasoning with objects. You've got a submodule for causal reasoning with creatures. You have a problem-solving module. You have a reputation module. I feel like there are so many very highly specific submodules that ultimately construct cognition in the way that we experience it. And I'm really eager to explore this idea in more detail. I just haven't had an opportunity to do that yet.
Okay, good. Okay, so just two more questions. The next one is because I know that you've been asked this when you were defending your dissertation. That is, the professors that were evaluating you, I think, asked you at a certain point if you thought that perhaps the evolutionary process, as it was put forth by Darwin and then expanded by others over the last 150 years or so, if it really only promoted selfishness in people and in other animals. And I think you had a really interesting answer to that, so if you could share it with us.
Yeah, so again, I don't think that we can talk about the evolutionary process promoting selfishness because, one, we're not really privy to the way in which these things affect us, right? We can only work with the proximal causes of our behavior, the things that we experience, both within ourselves that are obviously unreliable and how we perceive others. So I think we just kind of, you know, we live and breathe these things. We're a part of this system, and that's just that's the reality of it, right? The second fact that we need to remember and to emphasize is that we are social creatures, right? We have evolved in these small egalitarian groups. We have evolved to have a concern for one another, to have a concern for where we stand with respect to one another, to interact with one another, to promote the goodness of for one another, that, you know, for those that are part of our community. It just seems kind of silly to me to reduce, you know, this talk of having evolved to a matter of selfishness, right? I don't even think that that's something that I don't even know that that's necessarily worthwhile to consider. You know, we're social creatures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So the last question is it's about something that I really been thinking a lot about recently, and I think that the first person I asked about this was perhaps Simon Blackburn or someone like that. And then I also had this conversation with Rebecca Goldstein. I'm not sure if it is in the interview or not, because I've had a long conversation with her before we started recording. But anyway, do you think, because I mean, it is very important for people, this question about the meaning of life. And I guess that from a Darwinian perspective, we could give it a new twist, in the sense that since the things that we usually associate with life having meaning, like, for example, our emotions, our moral sentiments, and other things like that, since we know nowadays that all of those things that we have and that we named, they are really real. They are as real as atoms and any other thing in the universe, because they are features of the mind that evolved for us to adapt to our environments, and particularly to our social environments. That I mean, even if people do not pay a lot of attention to it, if they are, for example, very cynic or nihilistic, that those things that are the ones that in which we base the meaning of our lives, if life really then has some sort of objective meaning, and I'm not framing it in the sense of life being good or bad, or what is good or what is bad, but just that the tools that we need to create meaning in our lives really exist in that sense.
Yeah. Can you kind of rephrase that question a little bit?
Yeah. Okay. So what I was trying to say perhaps was that. So when people refer to the meaning of life, they usually talk about certain things like morality and emotions and feeling this or feeling that in their lives, like love, for example. That is a thing that people really bring a lot to the table when talking about life being meaningful or not. So I'm not saying that people should or always value those things, but just that because we know through Darwinism and evolutionary biology and psychology that those things really exist, then that would mean that the tools we use cognitively to give meaning to life, that at least that really exists. And so in that sense, life would be objectively meaningful, even if you give different values to those things, let's say. I don't know if it's more clear now, but...
Yeah, so I guess for clarification, is the question whether or not life is meaningful beyond the existential sense of, somehow it's subjectively meaningful for yourself? Is that sort of the question?
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. In the sense of the things that we think about when we attribute meaning to life or not, that they really exist in the sense of love really existing and not only being something that we come up with in our heads. That it is also part of the evolved repertoire of our minds, and so they exist as any other thing in the universe.
Yeah, I think that that's correct. My thought about it is that I think part of the hang up that causes so much existential dread for so many of us is that when we think of the meaning of life, whether or not life is meaningful, worthwhile, etc., we tend to do this from a Cartesian perspective, right? We introspectively, evaluate or assess our mental states, our emotions. And we're just like, I'm just not happy with anything right now. Life is worthless, etc., etc., etc. Or we look at our quality of life and we think, I can't do anything. Nothing's working out. Life is no longer worth living, etc., etc., etc. Evolutionarily speaking, we've got a lot of feedback mechanisms that tell us when we're on the right track with things, right? So, when we do something worthwhile, whether or not it's something as simple as satisfying our hunger pangs or contributing to a community, we get some nice dopamine rewards and we feel good about everything, right? The other side of it too is that I think when we're, musing about the meaning of life, we have to look at it from the perspective not of the Cartesian solitary reasoner, but from the perspective of behavior and from the perspective of, how we promote the good of the community, if you will, right? The community of which we're a part. And this is something that I didn't get a chance to clarify earlier in the conversation, so I want to make clear about this. There's not one community of which we're a part of, right? We're not a part of the human community in this cosmopolitan sense. There's numerous small communities of which we're a part of. It's in an indefinite number of small communities, right? So, your political orientation constitutes a community of which you're a part of. Your religious beliefs constitute a community of which you're a part of. Your family constitutes another community of which you're a part of. Sometimes there are tensions that arise between the demands of one community and the demands of another that we need to resolve. And that tension can cause quite a bit of stress for ourselves and perhaps even, incline us towards a depressive state or a depressive mood because we can't figure out how to satisfy the demands from both. So, when it comes to the meaning of life, I don't look at it as personal meaning, subjective meaning, or existential meaning. I just kind of see how it is the individual plays a role in a broader, society, a broader community, and that meaning emerges out of their activity and their contributions to those communities. In other words, making them somehow better. And of course, we can, sort of have a conversation about what constitutes better, and we can give evolutionary responses to that. Maybe not, though. Cultures. I think we're still learning what constitutes a good culture. Here in the West, we have a tendency to think that democracy and Western values are the only good values that there are. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. We need to have a conversation about that. But when it's all said and done, what makes life meaningful is, having a place within a broader community and feeling valued and worthwhile. And, that's why I think that no matter how hard life gets for an individual, as long as they feel like they're respected and valued and that they're contributing, you know, that life is meaningful for them. It's meaningful for the community. And I think a tremendous case in point here is someone like Stephen Hawking, right? You know, there's not a person that arguably had it worse in terms of quality of life, and yet he was able to overcome that in almost Nietzschean-like fashion and make tremendous contributions to the scientific community, and we love him for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, so Derek, just before we finish this here, is there already any place on the internet where people can find your dissertation?
Yes, my dissertation has recently been uploaded to the electronic and you know, dissertation and theses archive. We can have a link for that in the YouTube description. I encourage anyone to read it, offer feedback. You know, I really enjoy these conversations, and I'm not wedded to any ideas. You know, let's talk about it, see where things go, and maybe things will change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. So I will be putting that in the description box of the video for people to go there and check it out. It's very interesting, and we haven't really covered all of it in this conversation. But anyway, Derek, it was really a pleasure again to have you on the show and to talk about these issues with you.
Oh, thank you so much, Ricardo. I couldn't appreciate the opportunity more, and it was delightful.
Hi everybody, thank you for coming to my channel and for watching this interview until the end. I've started this channel in February 2018, and so I've been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields, and I would really like to ask you just to consider visiting my Patreon page and making a pledge there. Any amount, even $1, would already be a great help. And so otherwise, if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons: KARIN, LIETZCKE, and BLANCHETTE, Per HELGE LARSEN, Lau GUERREIRO, CHANTEL GELINAS, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunde, and Brian Rivera. Thank you for all.